Welcome back to another episode of Record Live. It is amazing to be with you. We are talking about something that's a little bit heavy today, but incredibly important. We're joined by Dr. Paul Bogacs from the Avondale University. Paul is the sort of course convener for counselling courses, and you've got a few other roles, Paul. Do you want to just tell us briefly about yourself?
Thanks, Jared, and it's really good to be with you and chatting to you both. I'm the course convener for our undergraduate and postgraduate degrees in counselling here at Avondale. I also lecture and still have a full teaching load here at Avondale. I also run a small private practice alongside just to make sure I don't get bored.
Just to keep the tools sharp, I suppose.
Most of us who teach counselling actually run a private practice so that we don't lose touch with what it is that we are training our students to do.
No, I think that's very important. And so the topic of today, look, it's a heavy one, as I mentioned earlier. Domestic and or otherwise known as family violence, violence that happens in the sanctity and the safety of someone's home, intimate partner violence. These things are far more common than I think many of us realize. I wrote an article for Signs of the Times recently, and I was sort of reflecting on, I think when I was a kid, it was sort of something that I thought maybe happened to someone else, like it was a different demographic, or maybe it was much more prevalent in other countries. But as I've seen stats come out and I've realized it happens in the church, it happens in Australia, it happens in my neighborhood, it's everywhere. Let's just start by, why do you think it's such a prevalent problem in all levels and all classes and all facets of society? Why does it exist, and why haven't we stamped it out yet?
Excellent question that we could spend 2 hours talking about easily. Maybe we could look at this from two perspectives, perhaps firstly a theological perspective. And the theological perspective would say that we are in a broken, messed up world with broken, messed up people. And therefore we would expect relationships also to get messed up. And domestic violence is probably an extreme example of how relationships get messed up. And interesting, in the original creation story there in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, it is after the fall that we have the first record of conflict between Adam and Eve, where they start blaming each other and blaming God and blaming the serpent and everybody else for the choices that they've made. And we get that text there in Genesis. It's important to note that that's after the fall and not before, where God says, and you will have labor in childbirth, you will have pain, and you will be submissive to your husband. Your husband will rule over you, I think. And I would argue that that's not a command that God gave, but rather a description of what was going to happen once sin had come into the world, that immediately there would be inequality. And I think that inequality, to an extent, it undergirds domestic violence. And so as soon as there's any type of idea that you have authority over me, because of our sinful human nature, we use that authority. Historians talk about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's some of the same thing. We don't seem to be able to handle power in a way that is respectful and in a way that doesn't become abusive. As a human species, we don't seem to pull that off. And you can look at a number of political situations in the world right now, even as we speak, where that is being demonstrated, where nations who have a lot of firepower can pretty much get away with whatever they want to get away with. And so that's from a theological perspective. From a psychological perspective, many researchers in this field would tell us that domestic violence, intimate partner violence, we sometimes call it patriarchal terrorism, to distinguish from situational violence, and it's important to make that distinction. In this kind of patriarchal terrorism, usually it's male against female, while situational violence can be either way. And this, psychologist tells us, tends to come from a place of insecurity on the part of the male. That this insecurity that I don't know that I have control over the world, but one thing I can do is control my wife and my children. That I can do. So darn it, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. And we see that done with a lot of force. And so domestic violence then goes into not just the hitting that occurs, but the sort of stuff I've met in clinical practice, checking her phone. In fact, if I'm screening for domestic violence, I'll always ask that, does your husband check your phone? Oh, yeah, he regularly checks the phone to see if there's any men's names on there that I don't approve of, or that shouldn't be there, or that they're not a professional relationship, that kind of, and again, I'm not sure how to control my own inner turmoil and insecurity, and therefore I need to control whatever I possibly can. It also can be the result of abuse that happened to that person growing up. In other words, they saw it happen. They saw dad hit mum. They saw dad yell. They saw mum give in, and then dad would calm down. So the behaviour was reinforced, and so they learned it. We learn. One of the three ways that we learn is through observation, and it is not unusual to find that people who have watched that in their family, they may determine they're going to do it differently, but then the default pattern comes back in. So they can do it differently, often during courtship, but then once the marriage starts, things change. And I have had women say to me, he changed on our honeymoon night. It was like he flipped a switch and became a different person, and I was in shock. And at first I excused that he was stressed or whatever, and then realized this was actually characterological. So this type of domestic violence, the intimate partner terrorism, we talk about it, is characterological rather than situational. That was a very long, convoluted answer, Jared. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Paul, it kind of astounds me that this is still such a big issue, because I feel like we have a lot more people parading about, like there's a lot more rallies happening, there's a lot more social media awareness. Counselling is a lot more normal these days, it's less taboo. There's a lot more accountability, there's a lot more talk on like healthy masculinity. So is there hope for us as humans to, like, I don't know, minimize this more or get rid of it? Because I guess what I'm hearing from your like theological perspective is like, this is just how we are. So why is it like still such a big thing, do you think? And what is there hope for us in your opinion?
Yeah. Again, excellent questions, Anita. I think, have we made progress? Without doubt. Without doubt, we've made progress. The very fact that we talk about it. It wasn't talked about when I grew up as a kid. It was seen as a private matter and no one else's business. It happened, but we certainly didn't talk about it. So we've come a long way, particularly in Western countries, in some developing countries. It's still not talked about very much, but in Western countries, we talk about it openly, we talk about it honestly, we do research on it. This didn't happen, 40 or 50 years ago. So we have made progress. I think, from a practical point of view, there are some problems in the way the law is administered. I think there are problems in the police force training as to their lack of understanding of domestic violence and what it can lead to. There are far too many stories of women reaching out for help again and again and again and again, and the police saying, sorry, we can't do anything. And I've had this, I know of cases where this has been said, we can't do anything until he does something. And you go, really? That's what we're trying to avoid, him doing something? Because when he does something, it'll probably be pretty bad. And we know of cases where he did do something because he couldn't be arrested before he's done something, and people have ended up being dead as a result of it. So I think there is a problem there. And while we talk about healthy masculinity, we need to remember that not everybody's on board with that. I've just forgotten the name of probably the most prominent example of toxic masculinity, who is all over social media, and many of the teenage boys expose themselves to his stuff, and you probably know who I'm talking about, and his name has just slipped my mind. And it's interesting that the social media feed for a 16-year-old boy is very different than it is for a 16-year-old girl, or for an older male, or for, it will lead them to those kind of sites that are likely to be more attractive to them. And they often contain very, very negative images of male masculinity, this big fear that, women are taking over, men are not allowed to be real men anymore, all of this kind of stuff. And again, really, really unhelpful. So we're not speaking with one voice yet in society. I think we are speaking with mixed voices. They're really healthy models of masculinity. Steve Biddulph and his groundbreaking book, 20, 25 years ago, called Manhood, very, very powerful as he tries to give healthy models of masculinity. His book, Raising Sons, was also an attempt to do that. But he's not the only voice on the scene, and that's, I think, part of the problem.
The temptation might be to believe that if you're in the church, it doesn't happen. If you're a Christian, it doesn't happen. And yet, some of the masculine movements, I suppose, that are being pushed, that you've reflected, may not be quite as toxic as Andrew Tate, but they're happening in the church as well. And domestic violence, statistically, we know it does happen in the church. Can you tell us a little bit about why you think it still happens in the church, and what should the church and can the church do about such an issue?
I'm glad you remembered Andrew Tate's name. That's very good. Thank you. I felt bad that I couldn't bring the name. Let me introduce you to a book. And I must say that in preparing for the End Now Summit on Friday night, I'm finding myself to becoming quite emotionally disturbed as I'm reading accounts of domestic violence, as I'm exposing myself to material to try to get a better grasp on this topic. And an excellent book published in 2016 by Ruth Tucker is called Black and White Bible, Black and Blue Wife. And it is very confronting reading. She was married to a pastor. She herself is a professor of theology or biblical studies. I think it's theology at a Trinitarian Evangelical College of Divinity. And really, really interesting accounts that she gives of the domestic violence relationship that she ended up leaving. If you can bear with me, I would just like to read one small paragraph because I think it's very significant. During his violent rages, my ex-husband often hurled biblical texts at me as though the principal tenet of Scripture was, wives, submit to your husbands. He spit the words out repeatedly, beating me over the head, at least figuratively, with his black and white Bible. His hitting and punching and slamming me against doors and furniture, however, were anything but figurative. Nor were his terror-laden threats. I felt trapped and feared for my life, while outwardly disguising bruises with long sleeves and clever excuses, pretending that ours was a happy marriage. And I think that's been one of the problems, Jared, is that we haven't talked openly about that. It is only more recently that we've talked openly about sexual abuse in the church. It is only more recently that we've actually faced, yes, men hit Christian men, or men who go to church regularly hit their wives. And there is a good deal of evidence to show that it certainly does happen in the church, and that some of the perpetrators are leaders and members of the clergy or in other leadership positions of the church. And if that doesn't disgust us, then I don't know what will. And if that doesn't, call us to action and rally us to make a loud voice against that, then I don't know what will.
Yeah, I think even though the statistics don't align with the rest of the world, it's still horrifying that there are such high statistics in the church. But it reminds me of something that you wrote about. You wrote an article for The Record on this topic recently, and you quoted the National Change the Story framework, and you said that men who hold traditional and hierarchical views about gender roles are more likely to perpetrate violence against women, which I think is fascinating. Because I think many of us, we believe in the Bible, we believe in traditional values, but we don't believe in that, certainly. Do you think that is just mostly a misstanding of Scripture? Or do you think, often people who don't believe in the Bible, they say, oh, that was just for a certain time, or that was just a certain culture. What are we kind of getting wrong, and why is that contributing to this?
And I'm going to speak in more detail about that at the enditnow Summit on Friday night, but just as a little bit of a brief description or introduction to it, there are basically two ways that people look at the roles of men and women in the church today. And one is what we call a complementarian perspective. Women and men are equal before God, but have very different roles. And one of the roles of men is to be in authority. That's one point of view. The other is the egalitarian point of view, and the view of mutual submission, which Paul talks about straight after he says, wives, submit yourself to your husbands. The people who take that second point of view would say that the texts, and actually not that many about female submission, there's actually not much in it, but that those have to be looked at culturally. They have to be looked at in the same way that we might look at the text where Paul says, slaves, obey your masters. Yeah, and you could say, well, see, Paul is promoting slavery. And it was interesting that a very large evangelical movement in the States actually split from the rest of their denomination in the 1850s over the issue of slavery, because they were not prepared to give up slavery, and they made theological justifications for slavery. And of course, it is that same large evangelical movement that promotes complementarian views in marriage and doesn't believe women should be in leadership and they shouldn't be ordained. And sometimes women are even encouraged to stay in domestic violence relationships and pray for their husbands. I would argue that simplistic theology is not neutral in its effects. It's not neutral, and it can be dangerous. And I would argue that some of the views on this are hermeneutically problematic and practically possibly dangerous, because they can lead to situations where pastors may advise women who come to them for counsel to stay in relationships that they should run from as fast as they can, because it's dangerous to them and their children. So I think it is hard not to make a link, and we've got to be careful that correlation, obviously doesn't necessarily mean causation, but there is certainly evidence. This we do know, that there is evidence to suggest that men justify their violence based on the use of Scripture. Just like the example that I read you out from Ruth Tucker, well, after all, I'm the head of the house, and while, I'm sorry, I got a little bit too angry and I shouldn't have gone as far, but you also shouldn't have disobeyed me. So, for me personally, I go back to what was the ideal in the Garden of Eden, and we don't have inequality in the story until the entrance of sin. So surely, if the church is about redemption and restoration, surely it is to take us back to the Edenic ideal, not to the post-fall version. So I think we have to, one of the things that I think we do, Sunita, is that we are so busy trying to be faithful to a particular text that we lose sight of the forest for the trees. We get hung up on the text here or there rather than go, overall, what is God's design and purpose for men and women? And I think Paul, one of the texts that I think puts it beautifully, comes from the Apostle Paul. In Christ there is neither male nor female, neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. So on one hand he can say, slaves, obey your masters. On the other hand he says, there's actually no difference. There is actually no difference. So it was Paul giving practical advice to people on how to survive the culture of the day, rather than making normative, theological statements that are valid for all time. I would go with the former rather than the latter.
Thanks for unpacking that a little bit for us, Paul. And as you've alluded to, you'll be speaking this Friday at the End It Now Summit. We've mentioned End It Now a couple of times in this conversation. End It Now is an initiative of the Seventh-day Adventist Church to sort of address and I guess raise awareness of some of these issues. And I think it's a great thing to be talking about it and emphasizing it. But why do you think it's important that initiatives like this exist? Like, what purpose does it serve? Just to talk about them, does that really fix anything? Or is it actually good that this is becoming visible or an emphasis of the church?
I think it's excellent, and I commend those who started the End It Now initiative. Abuse thrives in secrecy. When you don't talk about something, when you have rules in your family of origin, those unspoken powerful rules, which is we don't talk about what happens inside the family, outside of the family. And many people grew up in families where that was a rule. What happens in the family stays in the family. Well, what about when what happens in the family is actually dangerous and abusive and destructive? And if that stays within the family, that destroys people. So why do I think it's important for us to deal with it? I think we need to not compartmentalize the message of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, and the gospel, and to simply go, yes, Jesus has forgiven all of my sins and died on the cross, and I'll be going to heaven when Jesus comes, without asking the second question, which is at least as important, which is, so what? What difference does that make to the way I treat people? What difference does it make to the way I treat the people in my family who I say I love the most? And I think so often in Christendom, and we've done this in the Seventh-day Adventist Church as well, we have compartmentalized. And so over here is my God stuff, and over here is my relationships with people and the way I do life, and we keep them very separate. And we don't realize that you can't actually do that. They are meant to totally intertwine. The teachings and the life of Jesus, his redemption, his salvation, it's actually meant to change everything. I think that's why Jesus says you've got to take up your cross and follow me. In other words, give it all up. Who wants to save his life will lose it. In other words, everything's got to change. Your attitudes, the way you deal with people, the way you look at social issues, the way you look at justice in the world, the way you treat the environment, everything is impacted by the principles of the kingdom. And now when you take the principles of the kingdom, as spelled out by Jesus so beautifully in the Sermon on the Mount, and you apply them to relationships, then wow, I think things take on a very, very different perspective.
I love what you're saying. I'm excited for this presentation you're doing at End It Now. But I guess on that, if we do start to suspect things within our families, or if we start to suspect it within other families, I think a lot of people just freak out and they don't know what to do. Maybe they do the right thing, maybe they do the wrong thing, maybe they don't do anything at all. But what are some of the ways that people can respond to this, or what are some of the ways that they probably shouldn't respond to this as well?
Yeah, Let's start with ways to respond. I would argue, first and foremostly, don't keep it to yourself. Don't just try to suck it up. Don't just try to pray through it. God works not just through direct answers of prayer. He works through people and support systems. I think that's the most important thing. Go and talk to somebody, preferably a mental health professional, somebody who will be able to give direction and advice and resources. And I think it's very, very important in key principles that we believe in as counsellors is that people have to take accountability for their actions. People can't hide behind their background, even their mental illness. They have to take accountability. Just because I suffer depression does not give me the right to become abusive. Yeah, it doesn't give me that license. It may be the reason that I become abusive. It doesn't excuse the abuse. I need to deal with that in other ways. So, and I do believe that if someone feels unsafe in a family where there has been hitting, I do believe the police need to be called. And I think they need to be called. My own feeling is they need to be called the first time it happens. Don't wait for it to become a habit the first time. I believe, and I've said this to couples where there has been some intimate partner violence, I have said very, very strongly that any touch that is done in anger in an intimate relationship is wrong, totally inappropriate, and a crime. And we need to take it that seriously. And sometimes when it starts at the lower level and the person is actually made to be accountable for it, in other words, they can't get away with it, then I have known of situations, a number of situations, where the perpetrator has realized that they are following a pattern and that they have choices and that they can make different choices. Before, there's an established pattern of violence and abuse and emotional abuse. So I talk to women who are in this situation about the importance of firm boundaries and the importance of, there has to be a line in the sand. If this happens again, let me tell you what I will be doing. And that should probably involve, I will be moving out and I will be moving, to somewhere safe. And you just need to know that that's what's going to happen. And if it is not safe to say that in person, then that person the victim needs to find ways of saying it that are safe. And here's where mental health professional can be helpful. And sometimes people do that once they've left. And I know of a situation recently where she did exactly the right thing, packed up, went to family, and then he was told what was going to happen. So in other words, victims need to actually do what they can to take charge and to go, okay, this is what's going to happen. I need you to agree to this. I need this, never to happen again. And if it does, that will be the end of the marriage. And so you've got this one chance to work on this, to do whatever it is you need to do so that these conditions are met, and then not to give in on that, because once you compromise on that, you are reinforcing bad behavior. So it's about accountability, I think, Sunita. It's about accountability and safety. I would argue those two things are important. And as counsellors, the first thing we do when we suspect any of this is we check that the victim is safe, that they're in a position where they're safe, because that's really, really important.
What about for some suspected, or someone comes to us in a church? It's not happening to us or to our family, but it is happening, or we're suspecting it's happening. Excuse me. I know we can put others in danger if we do the wrong thing, potentially, in that situation. How should we act if we're suspicious that abuse is happening, or that there's signs or evidence of it?
Firstly, I think we should say to the person we're concerned about, a friend or someone in church, that, hey, I'm here for you. You can ring me anytime. I will be here for you. I also won't be sharing, this and gossiping about this, but I just want you to know that I'm here because I suspect you may need some support and help. And secondly, I think the person needs to encourage a person to get professional help. Counsellors, psychologists, even some GPs, can provide valuable assistance here to help the person be able to chart the way forward and see what the options are. We can't force somebody to leave a domestic violence situation. And the other thing I'd say here is that it often takes people quite a long period of time before they can leave. Because if you have been, for example, you're a woman and for 20 years, you have been put down, you've been hit, you've had insults thrown at you, you've been told all kinds of things. And one of the things that perpetrators will say is, you're lucky I married you, no one else would have. Yeah, that sort of stuff. Your self-esteem and your ego, sense of self is so low that to suddenly pack yourself up and the kids and find a refuge somewhere or somewhere where you can live, that takes a lot. And it takes support outside of that family till you get empowered enough to actually be able to do that. And so we have to actually be patient with people on the journey and continue to say, I'm here, and when you're ready, I'll do whatever you need me to do. But we have to realize that people aren't necessarily going to be able to do that just like that. But I look at that. If I have clients come to me in that situation, for me, it's a no-brainer. Get out of there. Get out of there by yesterday. And whatever you're going to do, if you're going to try to save the marriage, do it from outside where you are safe and where you have some control. But that's easy for me to say because I'm not in that situation, and I haven't had someone tell me for years about how hopeless and useless I am. And unfortunately, when we are told something often enough, we then begin to believe it. And that's the problem. So patience is really important, realizing that it might be a long journey, but we need to be there for the person that we're trying to help.
Awesome. That's all really helpful. For anyone who is interested in learning more and hearing more, the End Now Summit is this Friday and Saturday. We'll put the link in the comments so that people can, see more information. I think there's 2 rallies happening, and then there's obviously people can tune into your presentations online as well. Is that right, Jared? Anything I've missed?
Yeah, I believe Victoria, it's happening, and also Sydney. And obviously there's the online options. We will put the link in the comments to the End It Now programs. But Paul, in the meantime, thank you so much for spending some time this week with us. There were some very valuable insights shared there, and it is a very important topic, and we're grateful that you could shed some light for us.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. It's been awesome having you on.
Thank you so much, and it's been good for us to talk about such an important and quite an emotional and quite a laden issue.
Very much so. Until then, everyone on our Record Live channels, our Record Live family, we pray that you have a good week, and God bless.